Joining us now to discuss the recent roller coaster in crypto events and possible regulatory implications is SEC Commissioner Hester Peirce. Welcome, Commissioner Peirce.
It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, a lot going on, and I know you don't like to discuss specific companies too much, but this is bringing so many important issues out that I think we can maybe talk about in a more generalized way. We have this tweet here from Senator Elizabeth Warren, basically saying that the SEC should be doing more. In the collapse of one of the largest crypto platforms shows how much of the industry appears to be smoke and mirrors, and sort of demanding that the SEC do more. So before we get to that tweet specifically, I just want to kind of look at, basically we have the situation with FTX, and FTX is a non-US company, right? We're not talking about FTX US, we're talking about FTX. And I guess my question is just, generally speaking, what conditions would need to be met for this to sort of fall under the SEC's purview? Like, my understanding is, for example, if FTX had, customers in the US or investors in the US or employees in the US, like what conditions would need to be met for this even to be the SEC's problem?
Well, look, I can't talk about specific companies, as you pointed out, and I think facts and circumstances around what's going on now are still developing, of course. So taking it apart from any particular company, our jurisdiction is broad. Obviously, our jurisdiction is tied to securities, and we do not have jurisdiction typically over foreign companies that are not listed in the United States and that don't have customers in the United States, even if they are trading securities. But again, our jurisdiction is quite broad, and so even in instances where there's not a lot of U.S. activity, sometimes we do bring enforcement actions.
Hester, we have some breaking news right now. So FTX releasing this news release, FTX Group companies commence voluntary Chapter 11 proceedings in the United States, begin orderly process to review and monetize assets for benefit of global stakeholders. Sam Bankman-Fried, the CEO of FTX, is now resigning and will stay on as his capacity to begin an orderly process to review and monetize assets. So it's interesting that they are filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy proceedings in the United States, being a non-U.S. entities, but they do have several affiliate companies in the United States. What would be the SEC's involvement in something like this?
Again, I can't speak to what the SEC is or is not or may be doing in connection with this particular company. Our jurisdiction is linked to whether or not an entity is trading securities. As you can imagine, that's our remit. And so I think you can look at similar instances, but whether or not a company is going into bankruptcy is not itself relevant.
Yeah. Well, following up on Senator Elizabeth Warren's tweet, so she specifically said we need more aggressive enforcement, and I'm going to keep pushing the SEC to enforce the law to protect consumers and financial stability. Is that what is needed at this time?
Well, we have a constant obligation to enforce the securities laws, and that's something that we're doing every day. We're working on that. A large portion of our staff is dedicated to working on enforcement, and so of course that is something that we will continue to do. The bigger question, I think, is whether we could do a better job on the regulatory side, and that's where I've tried to push the agency to be more proactive in developing regulations and answering some of those core questions around when are things securities and therefore within our jurisdiction. And then going to the second step of answering if things are securities, then what can entities dealing with those securities do? And are there adjustments that we can make that would still achieve those objectives of protecting investors, facilitating capital formation, and protecting the integrity of the marketplace? Are there adjustments that need to be made to accommodate unique aspects of this technology?
So Commissioner Peirce, I maybe even have asked you this before, but Tim Massad, who was former CFTC chair, had suggested or recommended that the CFTC and the SEC should oversee potentially a self-regulatory organization, that Congress should act to implement that to cover the spot and futures markets in crypto. In other words, and derivatives. In other words, that because crypto is kind of this new asset class, and at the same time, trading on it in the spot markets and in the futures markets kind of overlap a lot, that this would make the most sense. Do you agree with that sentiment, that there should be some sort of self-regulatory organization, an SRO, overseeing U.S. crypto exchanges, and having the SEC and the CFTC work together to govern that? And do you think Congress should act? I know you probably will hedge that and say no, but nonetheless, do you think that maybe that's the time is right for it, especially in light of what just happened with FTX?
Well, I won't hedge it and say no. I'll hedge it and say that Congress is Congress and they get to write the laws, and I have a job in implementing them when those laws direct the SEC to do something. I think a self-regulatory organization is one suggestion that people have made, because it would allow for regulation by people who have the technological expertise and the deep understanding of the industry. There are counter arguments to that. We have self-regulatory organizations now, and there's some difficulties that come from having both a self-regulator and then a regulator on top of it. And I think those difficulties could be compounded if there are two government regulators on top of the self-regulator. But again, it's one option. And I'm sure that Congress is thinking about a whole range of options. We know that in the last year, they've come up with a number of different legislative proposals. And I think that there'll be more consideration, and the recent events will certainly inform that consideration.
Now, you generally err on the side of...
I think working together, having the SEC and CFTC work together makes a lot of sense. And it's something that Commissioner Pham at the CFTC and I have called for us to do. And even before before Congress acts, we can do a lot of work jointly and get input from the broader public. There's some laws around how those kinds of conversations have to be structured, but we certainly could be working on that.
So what would be the most efficient way to do it? I know you tend to err on the side of letting the markets decide should be done. So what do you think would be the most efficient method if there's going to be any regulation of the crypto markets? How would you like to see it done? Is it just SEC? Would it be CFTC? Where would you? How would you structure it if you were?
Efficiency is when we're talking about writing rules and writing laws. Efficiency isn't always the dominant thing that you're looking at, right? The dominant factor. You also need to make sure that you're using due process, and you want to have broad involvement of the public, of people who are actually using crypto, of the industry, a broad swath of the industry, not particular entities. You want everyone's involvement. And so sometimes that's not actually a very efficient process. Now, I think you're asking me the more fundamental question of whether it should be the SEC and the CFTC that regulate crypto. What we need to remember is that the SEC used to have an Office of Internet Enforcement, right? And now that when we think about that, we think that sounds kind of funny, right? Because everything touches the internet now, and everything is touched by the internet. And it could well be the same way with crypto, that crypto ends up being threaded through many aspects of the financial system and many aspects of society more broadly, in which case having one regulator devoted to crypto could be problematic. There are pieces of our jurisdiction where I expect, and I could be wrong because I certainly can't predict the future, but I expect that certain concepts from crypto, from certain blockchain concepts are going to be integrated into the back end of the financial system, in which case we need to be the regulator of it. should we be regulating spot crypto markets? I can make an argument that the SEC would be a good regulator for spot crypto markets if we got our act together and thought about how to do it, because we do have a long history of dealing with retail customers. At the same time, one could argue that it should be a combination of the CFTC and the SEC. We could bring to bear both of our expertise on it. So I defer to Congress ultimately, and I think there are a number of possible outcomes that would make sense.
Commissioner Peirce, just to sort of round this out. So, totally respect that you can't get into the details of FTX specifically. There's also a lot we don't know. But I would just love your impression of just this past week, right? And what it says about the crypto industry. I mean, this has been a stunning turn of events. We have, a billionaire, the so-called white knight of crypto, losing 94% of his fortune in a single day. We had sort of a proverbial run on the bank. We had another huge exchange kind of Binance come in and this crazy power dynamic and then leaving. And it's just been a crazy week, right? And I'm just curious what your personal takeaway is. Like, what does all this say about the crypto industry?
Yeah, it's been a difficult week and what's been a difficult year. And I think it's a good reminder for people to take some basic lessons from traditional finance into account. Counterparty risk is a real thing. You need to know when you're handing your assets over to someone else, what that someone else is doing with your assets, and you need to be thinking about what is at the core of crypto. And trading is not really the core of crypto. It's what a lot of people focus on, but that's not really the bottom line. So, This is not a great moment, and I think it's attracting a lot of negative attention, but understandably attracting a lot of negative attention. But at the same time, it can be a catalyst for us to sit down and do some of the regulatory work that's hard work. And that doesn't mean just bringing enforcement actions, though that may be part of what we have to do in any situation, right? As I said, we're always bringing enforcement actions, and it's not that enforcement actions are not something we should be doing, but we also need to know that as a society, thinking about how do we want to regulate this thing makes sense.
So my understanding is that the SEC is probing FTX and the handling of customer funds. What would give the SEC jurisdiction over a non-U.S. entity? What would those tools be, or what conditions would be required for the SEC to investigate a non-U.S. entity?
I'm not going to speak to any particular potential rumored future investigation. As I said at the outset,
is it a rumor? It's not. Is it a rumor? It's not actually.
I'm not speaking to any particular investigation of any particular entity that anyone is talking about here or that anyone has talked about otherwise. I cannot talk about ongoing or potentially ongoing or rumored ongoing or talked about ongoing investigations. It's just not appropriate for me to do that. So I'm not speaking to any investigation. As I said at the outset, the SEC has broad jurisdiction as it relates to securities. And sometimes, even when there's only a very tangential connection to the United States, we do bring enforcement actions. I've sometimes objected to our getting involved in situations where I don't think there's enough of a United States nexus. But sometimes those are questions of the discretion of the regulator. And as commissioners, we sometimes disagree with one another about how involved we should get in a situation where there's not a lot of U.S. involvement. So again, facts and circumstances matter tremendously for every one of our enforcement actions. We have to think very carefully about not only the facts and circumstances of that particular enforcement action, but about how to use our very limited resources. And so it's a difficult question.
Commissioner Peirce, this past week when the discussion happened that Binance would potentially acquire FTX, it raises a question as to whether or not non-regulated foreign entities should be owning U.S.-based exchanges potentially, because both Binance has a U.S. subsidiary, although It's kind of murky. FTX, same thing. U.S. subsidiary, kind of murky. They use the same names, et cetera, and the ownership structures are such. Is there any concern about non-regulated entities owning U.S.-based exchanges, crypto exchanges? Is there any concern with the SEC? And is that something that potentially you'd want to see rules put in place that would make sure that if these foreign entities at least own U.S. exchanges, that they themselves are also regulated in case there's a run on the bank, if you will, that may affect American customers?
So I think one of the interesting things that's come out of events recently is consideration about if we had regulation of spot crypto markets in the United States, what would it look like? And if we had federal level regulation, right? And one of the things that we look at when we regulate our equities exchanges, for example, is we do look at ownership. That is something that's considered. There's a whole range of things that's considered. Other things that you would want to think about is what's happening with customer assets that are being traded, obviously, on the exchange. So I think some good lessons that we can draw from this event if we think about crafting a regulatory regime for centralized spot exchanges, if that's what Congress decides to do.